Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to this episode of Maritime Matters. We're recording on the 12th of August, so we're recording on the Monday. Slightly different time slot, but hopefully we've got lots and lots to bring to you about the maritime domain and what's been going on. How are things with you, Jen?
Pretty good. Excited to be recording another episode of Maritime Matters. On the term of Maritime Matters, did you know that Geoffrey Till's most recent book, How to Grow a Navy, Chapter 1 is called Maritime Matters? And again, I feel like that's another prolific maritime person stealing the term Maritime Matters from us. I'm not sure Jeff's seen or listened to the podcast. But lots of good things. Had a piece out in the Australian Financial Review last week, also available on my website, talking about AUSMIN. What were the outcomes of the AUSMIN talks, and where do we really need to accelerate collaboration? GWEO is a key one, but we'll get to GWEO in a sec because there's been some good news on that point. What have you been up to?
I have not been doing enough maritime-related things. I have been doing all sorts of things that I would rather be talking about maritime stuff. So I'm going to park what I've been doing, my boring admin things, and hope we can get on to talk about some proper maritime-related fun, because we've got lots to cover today. So do you want to get us cracking by talking about what's been happening in the region?
So lots happening in the region. There has been an incident with a Philippines transport aircraft. I think it's a transport aircraft that they use for surveillance, which is pretty common. Had flares deployed in front of it from 1 to 2 Chinese fighter aircraft in the vicinity of Scarborough Shoal. Incidentally, this occurred, I think, within 24 hours of the completion of the MMCA, which is the Multilateral Maritime Cooperative Activity, a term that I hate. But effectively, looks like a passage
almost
exercise.
Like they heard you on the podcast, 2 weeks ago, and then they thought that a maritime cooperative activity wasn't enough, so they had to then put that multilateral bit in just to irk you that little bit more.
It does irk me. I mean, I spent 3 years as Navy's exercise planner out of MAROPS in Bungendore and never heard the term Multilateral Maritime Cooperative Activity. But there you go. Time has changed. That was a long time ago. But so we saw that take place in the last week between Canada, Australia, the Philippines, and the US. Australia contributed a P8. I'm not sure where from, but probably the P8 that operates out of Malaysia fairly regularly. But about 24 hours after this, we had the incident where this Philippines transport plane operating in the vicinity of Scarborough Shoal, which we know is a significant flashpoint between China and the Philippines. It is a shoal, low tide elevation, in accordance with the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal, if you're a legal geek, within the Philippines exclusive economic zone. But we saw this deployment of flares again. Now, I think it's significant because we had actually seen a reduction. Well, it looks like a reduction in this kind of behaviour this year. We did have the incident in the LOC in May where we saw an Australian helicopter operating from HMAS Brisbane have flares deployed in front of it. And a couple of other incidents this year, but it looks like, certainly from some of the reporting from US senior officials from Indo-PACOM, that there's less of these incidents. So it kind of stands out. What's your take on this incident?
In terms of the incident, I'm always in kind of two minds. Is it immediately a reference and a response to something, or is this just part of the, if this had happened another week, would we have been picking up on it in quite the same sort of way? But yes, it does look like this is something of a response. I thought the MMCA, for all of its dubious acronym, sort of notage, but I thought it's quite interesting. It's quite notable. Less about what actually happened, although the bringing together of 4 partners I thought was quite interesting, but particularly about the way it was flagged quite openly and really almost promoted, which I thought was interesting, and was clearly sent to try and make a statement. Was the Chinese activity a response to that statement? Well, we'll never know for sure, but you could certainly it doesn't seem too much of a reach to get there, I guess, would be my kind of conclusion.
Yeah.
Go for it.
No, you go.
I was just going to ask you about what your take was, barring your grumpiness about the name, about the MMCA. I saw you were talking a little bit about the fact that it was a PA involved.
Yeah, look, it's always an interesting one in terms of when we do these exercises, what we contribute, and sometimes you can read too much into what forces a country contributes to an exercise. There was a lot of debate about what Australia would contribute. Sounds like the MMCA, hopefully it doesn't catch on, was announced before the nature of Australia's contribution. The nature of Australia's contribution wasn't contained in the announcement. It was a P8, it wasn't a ship. We know that we have challenges in Australia in terms of the availability of ships at the moment. To be honest, I don't think it is too significant. I mean, you're not going to send a ship to every single exercise in the region, but I think it's just part of a broader conversation about the amount of ships the Royal Australian Navy has and how quickly we need to get after this general purpose frigate, which hopefully there'll be an announcement on the next couple of months. It's got to be. I think the other thing that was interesting, just to your point about how signposted the MMCA was, so this, quadrilateral, although not the quad, different quad, quadrilateral activities.
Not even the squad.
Not even the squad. In the Philippines Exclusive Economic Zone. So interestingly, the joint statement that came out, they put the names under the joint statement, which I don't think is entirely common. And they mentioned the Chiefs of Defence Force of, the three countries and the commander of Indo-PACOM. So I think that was all about the messaging. We've mentioned the incident with the Philippines and the Chinese aircraft about 24 hours after the MMCA. China did announce almost the same day as the MMCA that they would be conducting a joint exercise, or a Chinese joint exercise, in the vicinity of Scarborough Shoal as a response. And so these aircraft that responded to the Philippines transport aircraft probably were conducting that joint exercise. So certainly there's some signalling going on, and I think it was probably important to wrap the Canadian deployment of a ship to the Indo-Pacific into something like this. There has been a lot of questions about what about Canada and all of these new squads and quads and AUKUS and things like that.
Absolutely. Moving on, thinking about what else has been happening in the region, there's been some interesting news reporting about a potential Australian-Indonesian defence agreement. The details on this are still pretty sketchy at the moment, but this was something that was flagged much earlier in the year, that there was kind of work going on this, and it appears that we're sort of very much now sort of close to having something more substantial. So I think this is quite interesting. Obviously, Indonesia is hugely important in terms of Australian defence, and it is sort of hugely important, but also sometimes sort of slightly overlooked in quite a lot of the wider discussions. So I think that it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see when the full text comes out, precisely what is involved. We were talking just before we went live, Jen, about the fact that you were kind of pushing back slightly on quite how novel some of this stuff is, and highlighting that Australia already does quite a lot of stuff with Indonesia.
Yeah, look, I think it's great. So the defence agreement with Indonesia was actually signalled last year by Richard Marles, the Australian Deputy PM. So we've known this is coming for a long time. And it really is part of a long list of strategic agreements between the two countries. So we did have a fairly significant defence agreement that was agreed in the 90s. It was abandoned by Indonesia when Australia supported East Timor in the late 90s. But since then, we've kind of been building up the treaty agreement. So in 2006, we signed the Lombok Treaty, which is the agreement on the framework for security cooperation, of which maritime security is a key element of the Lombok Treaty. In 2012, we signed our Defence Cooperation Arrangement. Now, I'm not sure. I'm not a diplomatic specialist. So I'm not sure the difference between arrangements and agreements. I guess there is a difference because we intend on changing it. But so we just changed it. We signed that arrangement in 2012. Again, consistent, highly high maritime element. In 2014, we signed a joint understanding, the implementation of the Lombok Treaty. Again, talks about maritime. In 2018, we became comprehensive strategic partners, as if we weren't already, based on the list of those agreements, but now we are. In 2020, we signed the Comprehensive Strategic Plan of Action, so how we're going to implement being comprehensive strategic partners. And then this year, we're going to upgrade the Defence Cooperation arrangement to an agreement. My point there is, we've been signing these agreements for a very long time. It's great, don't get me wrong, we should focus on Indonesia. When you look north, what do you see? You see Indonesia. And Indonesia is absolutely pivotal to Australia's national security, right? Whether you think about it from a non-traditional maritime security lens and things like illegal fishing or irregular migration, or from a traditional security lens when you think about, any task group that might want to come down and, threaten Australia's offshore oil off the Northwest Shelf or interfere with Australia's maritime trade would come through the Indonesian archipelago. So it's incredibly important. But my point is, we do already do a lot of things with Indonesia. We have a series of maritime exercises that we've been doing and patrols, so coordinated patrols for a long time. And I did note, actually, in the latest Indo-Pacific Endeavour, so we didn't mention things that are happening, the Indo-Pacific Endeavour is about to kick off. So that's the task group deployment that goes to different regions. Started in 2017. I was lucky enough to be on the first one. This year's Indo-Pacific Endeavour, interestingly, also includes the first time a bilateral exercise between the Australian Defence Force, the Indonesian National Armed Forces, called Exercise Keras Woomera. Interesting choice of names. A lot of politics behind exercise names, by the way, which is a joint bilateral amphibious activity that includes complex air, land, and maritime training. It's the first time we've done that with Indonesia. So I think that's pretty significant. Anyway, that's a long counter through the history of recent treaties on defence issues and maritime issues between us and Indonesia. I think the defence arrangement that we're upgrading to, did I call it? I keep getting confused. It's a defence agreement. Agreement. The agreement is an upgrade from arrangement.
Yep.
I think it's great, but I don't think it's really any different to what we're already doing. We're clearly doing a lot. What's your take on it?
Well, I would push back slightly against your list because you've noticed all the up points in that chart, but you've not pointed to any of the kind of the down points. Well, apart from East Timor on 99, but there've been a number of drops in between there. So, and even more recently, AUKUS, for example, didn't necessarily go down hugely well in elements of Indonesian kind of elite opinion and sort of wider attitudes. So I think it's definitely positive. I think you're absolutely right in terms of the fact that a lot happens. I think actually in certain regards a lot more happens kind of slightly below the radar than people often actually acknowledge, and in some ways that level's a little bit easier at times than the diplomatic and sort of high political elements that bring sometimes their own challenges, particularly in Indonesia. So I think it's great to see, and hopefully it will also set the stage for sort of ongoing relationship building in terms of the new Indonesian president, because I think he takes office in October, something like that. It's certainly coming up relatively soon, and he's definitely been kind of playing a little bit to both sides. There've been some very quite positive comments, economic comments about the relationship with China, as well as sort of some more favourable comments towards what we might see as the kind of US-led type countries in the region, and most notably, obviously, to Australia. So I think that it's an interesting time. It's always an interesting time in Australian and Indonesian relations, but I think that it is definitely a positive step.
Look, I agree with you, and you're right. You can't talk about the Australia-Indonesian relationship without talking about the ups and downs. I did say that they cancelled our first defence treaty in the 90s. Look, it is, and those ups and downs do often affect the maritime domain. Sometimes they're generated from the maritime domain. There was, obviously going back a while now, a number of incidents, quite a while, I think maybe 10 years ago, under Operation Sovereign Borders, where we had released vessels in their territorial waters, right? So, not intentionally, it was a charting error, but still. So there are ups and downs in the relationship, but I don't actually think that will change. And I'm not sure. Again, I'm a huge supporter. I think the Defence Cooperation Agreement, I'm reading that to make sure I don't get it wrong. Defence Cooperation Agreement, which is an upgrade from an arrangement. Look, I think it's great. But I think the relationship will always have its ups and downs. And I don't actually think that'll change. And there's kind of three reasons behind that, from my view. One is I think we have a very different strategic history, right? Very different strategic history. Indonesia prides itself on its non-alignment, although sometimes it has been more aligned than it was willing to say. And it does have different focus in terms of its internal focus. It's a massive archipelago. I think it's like 17,000 islands or something crazy. And it's a huge population, right? Which have very different backgrounds within that archipelago. The second thing is Indonesia, a country that is seeking significant economic development. And that's something that Australia just can't provide. We do a lot, but can't provide at the magnitude which they need, which means they are always going to turn to China on that point, bar a significant conflict in the region where Indonesia is disadvantaged. And I think the third point that we'll always kind of see the ups and downs is Indonesia is more important to Australia than Australia is to Indonesia. And I mean, that's just a fact of geography. When we look north, we see Indonesia. When Indonesia looks north, it doesn't see Australia. So again, the relationship's important. They clearly see the relationship as important. But I'm not sure that the ups and downs that you rightly mentioned, that I did neglect, are going to change.
Not going to have any disagreement here. Moving on, talking about capability.
Yes.
We were talking only a couple of weeks ago about HMAS Sydney and the Naval Strike Missile. Do you want to run through the latest development?
Yeah, so Sydney's obviously stayed on post-RIMPAC. They've gotten a long trip to Hawaii. So they've stayed on. They've done what's called Exercise Pacific Dragon. I'm not sure if it really is an exercise. I think they've just stayed on to use the Pacific Missile Range, which is in Hawaii, which is pretty common for Australian surface combatants after they deploy to RIMPAC, especially when they have just integrated new missiles. For a long time, there's been a lot of discussion about Australia's missiles becoming a little bit obsolete, both in its anti-surface missiles and its anti-air missiles. It's a great development. So SM6 is an extended range anti-air missile. So, in an unclass environment, we say the SM2, it has about 90 nautical mile range. I don't want to say on a good day with a perfect target. But the SM6 reportedly has an unclassified range of about 130 nautical miles, so an extra 40 nautical miles. So that's great. It also has a anti-ballistic missile capability, and it does reportedly also have an anti-surface capability. Neither of those things seem to be really mentioned in the Australian press release about it. They were mostly focusing on the anti-air warfare extended range, which is a great capability, but it does also have the other two. So I think it's really positive. I think that with Sydney's firing of the Naval Strike Missile, obviously Sydney are having a cracking RIMPAC, I'm very envious. But it also shows how quickly Australia has managed to integrate new missiles when it has finally made the decision to do so. For a long time, we haven't really focused on this. So I think this is a good win and certainly something really positive that has come out of kind of defence acquisition. What's your take on Sydney's SM6 firing?
I think we talked about it before. I'd massively echo what you were saying about the speed with which some of this stuff is coming online, which is, as somebody who's often complaining about the slow, glacial at times pace of defence acquisition, it's really nice to be able to say that this stuff is happening. It's happening really quickly. It is significant step up in capability. I think the ballistic missile side of things is really important, and is really important not merely in the kind of the way people have been talking about it for a little while in terms of kind of long-range Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles, but we're also now only thinking about the Red Sea and the Houthis and all of these kind of things. So I think this is a capability which is going to be increasingly important for surface combatants. And the SM6 is very much kind of top of the range in terms of the kit that's out there. So I think it's all in all a really positive story. I think the question then comes about things like depth of arsenals, and the kind of wider integration into the fleet. But hopefully there'll be progress on that as well.
Yeah, and on the depth of arsenal piece, not to replug my Osmian article in the Fin Review, you should definitely check it out. But it talked about that, right? So, one of the things that we really do need to get after is this guided weapons enterprise in Australia. The FSP came out with it, kind of didn't move for 3 years, and the DSR kind of reinvigorated it, maybe even changed its name, I'm not even sure. And we have seen some movement since then in terms of agreements on what companies will be supporting it. There's certainly Osmin talked about the aim for Australia to produce a GMLRS for the Army by 2025 to start producing that in Australia. But we really do need to scale up our GUIO initiative to be looking at producing more complex weapons, like the Naval Strike Missile, like SM2, and like SM6. And this is where really that relationship with the US needs to come to the fore in terms of them agreeing to allowing us to produce these weapons, which I don't think we're close to, but I think that would be critical not only for Australian magazine depth issues, but also for US magazine depth issues, as we'll see more US ships operating out of Australia. What else has been happening in capability? There's been some AUKUS announcements. One that has got a lot of interest around AUKUS Pillar 1. In fact, it's being tabled in Parliament today. What's happening in AUKUS?
So I'll start off with the Pillar 1 stuff. So this is an agreement which is being a kind of a treaty level agreement. And this is where my international law stuff I need to check, because as I understand it, this does count as a treaty, even though it's called an agreement.
It is a treaty, yeah.
It effectively allows the exchange of not only information about nuclear propulsion, which was in the previous treaty signed in November 2021 or agreed in November 2021. This now facilitates the United States and the UK to transfer physical artifacts, so including reactors and everything that goes along with that. I thought some of the interesting stuff, at least initially, to my mind, was they were also talking about things around maintenance and other things, which I guess is perhaps some of the more immediately pressing kind of issues as they work towards Surf-West and that kind of build-up. In terms of the coverage of it, there was a lot of focus on a couple of remarks by Biden about sort of further political commitments, lots and lots of questions about what this means. I'm still not entirely sure as to what exactly that means, or if it means what lots of people think that it means. But having looked through the text of the treaty, which was released, or the draft text today, which was tabled in Parliament, I don't think there's anything that particularly jumped out to me, at least, as being a surprise at the moment. One of the things that I did immediately think about was there's obviously, unsurprisingly, a lot of focus on the security of the technology and the challenges that I think that will continue to pose from an Australian side, both in terms of things like vetting and clearances and the physical security of a lot of this stuff, which is just a step up from what most Australian there is at most kind of Australian bases and things already. So in that regard, I did not necessarily see it as much of a leap as was claimed, but an important waymark and continuing part of the narrative, which I think we both kind of agree on, which is that, broadly speaking, AUKUS Pillar 1, for better or worse, is on track, and a lot of the naysayers claiming it's falling over. I don't buy that at the minute. Anyway, that's my long rambling take on something. What's yours?
Yeah, I'm always surprised at the reporting around anything to do with AUKUS. Look, in terms of this treaty, I think anytime you do manage to get 3 countries to agree to a document that long, which is 37 pages, it's a major milestone. I think people underestimate how difficult it is to get countries to agree to things like the wording and things like that. So I think it is a major milestone. Does it tell us anything new about the agreement? Look, I haven't worked my way through all 37 pages at the moment, but from my scanning, look, no, I don't think it does, right? I do actually think, Richard Marles did a lot of press over the weekend talking about the fact that this is really just the legal underpinnings of the AUKUS agreement to allow for the transfer of nuclear-powered propulsion and all the things that go along with that. And I really do think that is the case. So there was a lot of reporting that it might enable the transfer of nuclear waste from the US, the UK to Australia. So Australia has to dispose of the nuclear waste of other countries. That's not in the agreement whatsoever. And the government has been very clear on that's not the case. The government's been very clear, and in fact, both governments, the current government and the previous government, were very clear on the fact that when we agree to the AUKUS deal, Australia would need to dispose of its own nuclear waste. So I can't see anything in this agreement that is specifically new or specifically interesting. As to the unspoken political commitments, or however that was referred to, look, I think you've got to remember with AUKUS, each government is trying to manage their own domestic challenges as well. And there is some concern in the US. I don't think it will take over in terms of decision making, but there is some concern in the US in terms of the impacts on their submarine industrial base, providing the 3 submarines to Australia as part of phase 2. So look, I think it's an interesting study of society, how much this stuff seems to make the press and get so excitable, but there's nothing new in this treaty except to say that kind of for the moment, AUKUS remains on track. Now, it may not always, right? It may not always. But again, another major milestone, getting 3 countries to agree to this treaty. So, yeah, I haven't really got much to add to it than that. Do you disagree?
No, that was very much my kind of take. There were also, you were talking about the Miles's press, and I thought actually there was quite an interesting interview with Miles while he was in Washington. And a few people did remark that Australian policymakers are often slightly more open in interviews they give abroad than they are here. But I thought it was actually quite a good one, and he talked quite a lot about both AUKUS Pillar 1 and AUKUS Pillar 2. And one of the things that I did pick up on and thought was interesting was his reference to, and he kind of almost corrected himself in the interview, talking about US submarine numbers, and then he talks about US submarine availability in terms of being a key kind of facilitator for the transfer of submarines to Australia. And I thought that was interesting, given the maintenance challenges that we know the United States has been having in terms of their submarine industrial base and the maintenance, the availability they have of their submarines. So I think that might be an interesting change of slant and a real focus on the kind of the maintenance side of things.
It is interesting how we do tend to hear more about our defence from overseas, whether that's our own officials overseas or other officials overseas. Go Sharks in the news. What's happening with Go Shark?
Is in the news. This is an announcement around the investment in the Ghost Shark industrial base. So we talk a lot about AUKUS and the industrial base. This is an announcement that both Anduril and the Australian government are going to be investing $20 million, I think it's $20 million each, into the kind of the co-production or the production and the supply chain for Ghost Shark. Ghost Shark is this very large USV, uncrewed UUV, uncrewed underwater vehicle. So basically, in popular parlance, a drone submarine, I guess, which is being developed by Anduril in sort of collaboration with the Royal Australian Navy or the Australian government. So this is looking to establish the production facilities in Australia. As far as I can tell, there's still only kind of official orders for 3 of these things. But the expectation clearly is that they're going to be able to kind of upscale that production. And once again, this is about building kind of sovereign capability. So it's building it in Australia. which I think is again quite interesting. Particularly this sort of sense of trying to build up Australia as a little bit of a hub in this kind of area, and there's obviously, to a degree, parallels with Ghost Bat. So the ghosts are carrying on to a degree in parallel. Beyond that, I didn't see a huge amount about the capability itself, and I did sort of look through all of the press and everything else, but it seems to be primarily that this is focused on the industrial side of things and the manufacture. Thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think it's positive. I have written a fair bit on, before you start massively acquiring USVs and UUVs, you need to have a clear concept of operations. But I'm willing to accept that probably exists behind some sort of classified firewall. But no, positive. So I think that, we agreed to order 3 Ghost Sharks. One has clearly been delivered. The third one will be delivered by 2025. I guess that means the second one is coming this year. And I note that the reporting of the new investment talks about really trying to take the Ghost Shark program from prototype development into production. So there's obviously an aspiration of the production of much more. That said, though, we don't know a lot about the capability. In fact, we know more about the capability of the intended AUKUS SSN than we do about the Ghost Shark, which is here and now. Certainly, Defence and Pat Conroy spoken a fair bit about the Ghost Shark and spoken about the fact that it will have ISR, so intelligence surveillance reconnaissance capabilities, as you'd expect, and some sort of offensive strike capability. Now, it would make sense that would be mining. That would make a lot of sense. But it's interesting that we're not talking about the capabilities openly. So that is interesting. Same trend, though, the way that the US are talking about their Boeing Orca. But apart from that, no. Look, I think this is positive. Hey, what else in capability? I think there's one other thing. Austal's kicking some goals again.
Oh yeah, what you can take this one. This is definitely more you than me.
Right, fantastic. So the Royal Australian Navy has received its 7th evolved Cape-class patrol boat. So I think the evolved Cape-class patrol boat is actually a pretty good success story that's not really talked about much. So we knew that the Royal Australian Navy many years ago was having issues with its Armidale-class patrol boats. Effectively, they were, there's all sorts of views on it, but I would say they were acquired and they were run a lot harder than they were expected to be run. And part of that is because we just simply don't have enough ships, right? We talk about we don't have enough surface combatants, but we certainly don't have enough patrol boats, and we certainly rely on them pretty heavily. So there was a decision made, I can't remember what it was, to replace the Armidale with the evolved Cape-class. Originally, it was an order for 6. That was extended to 8. Now it looks like it's an order for 10. So the 7th one has just been delivered to the Royal Australian Navy, and the 8th one is about to be delivered. So these have been built and integrated fairly quickly. We also know from the independent analysis team's review earlier this year into the surface combatant fleet that there's also an intent that ABF will be operating the evolved Cape-class too. So there's a common platform between the Royal Australian Navy and the ABF, which makes sense until I win the battle and we get a Coast Guard.
No, I think as you say, it is a good news story. I think it also speaks to the advantages of building a number of hulls and the challenges that often come with shipbuilding come so often in the first couple of hulls. And once you get a program that's up and running, there are definite benefits to keeping it running and to continuing to produce sort of ships off the end of that production line. So I think that I would like to say there's sort of, to a degree, lessons, but I don't think that is in any way a novel thing. It's about actually trying to make that happen. But compared to a number of the other projects that have been going on over recent years, this is definitely a success story.
Great. Well, look, I think that's all we've got time for. Great to chat to you, Richard. Look, time does matter. Thanks, Richard.